Oh yeah, it's Devlog time, baby! Welcome back to Devlog. In the last episode, I worked on the grappling hook system and then deleted it. And in this part, I'm working on the combat system, so the player may now take 1 life. Here we are, back again, in Blender. Let's talk about the animations I made. The first thing I did is make the combat string animations. This is the animation for your initial light swing of a one-handed weapon, and then the 2 combat string of a heavy attack with your one-handed weapon. I wanted to make these attack animations for 2 specific reasons. The first being that I'm adding combat to my game and I need animations for it. Kind of obviously. The second reason is that I've always had this really big fascination with combat animations in-game. Probably because I play way too many action games where players have big weapons and swing things at things. So I've always really liked combat animations in games, but I've always been pretty bad at animating them, if we're being honest. I've never really looked back at old combat animations I've made and felt like they were good. I've always felt like they were pretty subpar. So I've been excited to try and make them in this week's development log in a way that is good. These animations all lead on from each other, but when used in game system, these animations are actually spliced up into different sections, and I will explain why that is in a moment when I talk about the code aspect. Needless to say, it's very complicated, unnecessarily so. But for you viewing this now, all you have to keep in mind is when one attack animation ends, we will either transition to the next attack animation if we have made an attack, or we will stop doing this animation and we will go back to normal. You won't just press attack and then swing for 4 times wildly with a sword. The animations themselves were pretty simple. They are essentially just sword swinging animations. You swinging from right to left, then left to right, then right to left, then left to right again, and then these loop back in on themselves if you keep pressing your inputs. This is just if the player is using a one-handed weapon, but these can be used for a sword, a club, etc., etc. These attacks are very light and they are just using a one-handed weapon, so there isn't much weight behind them, but in the recoils of each animation I tried to have a decent amount of feedback for the player, swinging backwards and being pulled back by the momentum of their swing. This is very essential, I think, for attack animations, that you have to really simulate the weight of the thing in the player's hand and not just have kind of a stiff sort of a swing about. Even if you were to idly by yourself in your room swing nothing, you would still have a level of recoil based on your motions if you're really enthusiastically going for a good combat swing, which is actually how I made this animation. I just sat in my room and I did a little combat swings by myself, and then I did the poses, I animated the poses I made. On to the heavy attack animations. There's just 2 of these. They're a lot slower. This is you really holding back and then doing a very, very quick powerful swing and impact with your weapon, and you're being pulled back even further in your recoil because of the weight you are put behind this. Then the follow-up to this is you are crouching down in your recoil pose that you have been pushed into from your big old weapon swing, and you're pulling back up. Essentially, you're going from a swing crouch, and you're crouching with your weapon, and you're thrusting upwards to carry the momentum and stand you back up into the original pose. And this can just loop indefinitely if you were to just constantly press the heavy attack button and make a heavy attack. I am also a big fan of how this attack looks. If you want to know the story of how I designed this attack animation, which I'm going to tell you anyway, I was really stuck on what to do for a sword heavy attack animation, so I just started doing random poses myself in real life to see what felt natural for a heavy attack, and I just came into these 2 poses of reeling back for a swing and then carrying it through into a crouch, and then I kept doing that over and over to see if I had good momentum, and I enjoyed it, so I animated it based on how I did the poses in real life. in terms of animating this, that is something I haven't really had much positive experience in animating combat animations. It is useful to do real-life actualizations of your animations you want to do, so you can test how best to animate these poses and emotions. This is very true for most animation. If you're stuck on how to animate something, here's an animation pro tip. Do it in the real life and see how it looks, and then just animate what you did. So if you want, on this devlog, if you really want to, you may imagine me as my real life Flash self doing all of these poses with a fake sword in my home, because that's what I did. To animate these, I just did all of these things in my bedroom. Each animation itself is separated into a readying animation. This is you pulling yourself back and readying for a swing. A swing animation, this is you actually going to attack something. And then a recoil animation, this is you being pushed back into your final pose after you have done your swinging animations and your regular attacks. So when importing these animations to Unity, I will splice the animations into separate animations. So we would have swing 1 readying, swing 1 swing, swing 1 recoil, and then this would go into the swing 2 readying, swing 2 swing, swing 2 recoil, as we go through the timeline of this animation. And then I will use these individual animations for the combat scripting, because each of these different combat attack states has different logic for it. Because of course it does. It needs to be very complicated. So the animations themselves are separated into these 3 states, and that's because the player has different actions based on these 3 states. When they are in the readying section of an attack, they can cancel out of it with a dodge. This being you press your dodge button and you stop attacking. This is useful if the enemy you are aiming at has run away, or is currently out of range, or is going to hit you with something first, and you need to really cancel out of your attack and go into something else. This quickly stops your attack and cancels you out of it. Obviously this is based on the attack speed, so if you are using an attack that has a really slow readying time, you'll have more opportunities to cancel out of your attack, while if the attack has a quick readying time, once you press the attack you're just kind of resigned to attacking with that system. These are just based on the length of the animation, so if I wanted to, I could have the readying animation of certain weapons be significantly shorter, even though you are still readying in your motion, if I wanted the player to be kept in this animation and they wouldn't be able to cancel out of this certain attack. Like some sort of weapon that would be very high damaging but very slow to use, so you had to take into account this readying time and make sure you're not taking damage, for example. And this transitions into the attack swinging animation. When we are doing this, we can only be cancelled out of an animation if we take enough damage. So if we were swinging at an enemy and we took a huge amount of damage, we would then stop swinging, but this is a rare occurrence and isn't programmed in yet, so I'm not going to talk about it. In this state, all we do is search for damage, and we search for when we should be enabling our hitbox collisions, which I will talk about later. And that's pretty much it for the attack swinging. You swing the attack and you hit an enemy. After this we have the recoil amount. This is once we have finished an attack. We can either press our inputs again to go into a follow-up attack based on whatever input we have pressed, or we can wait and then we stop attacking. Also, as a quick tip, if you were in your recoil state and you press the dodge input, you can cancel out of this recoil state, so you don't have to recoil as much by dodging away from it. But the downside of this is you are wasting a dodge, and maybe those are based on stamina or some other system. So do you want a long recoil with your weapon, or do you want to waste a dodge? It's a dynamic gameplay choice you will have to make in Slug Glove's game. The hardest part of these animation and combat systems I usually find is setting up the animators in Unity so that you can transition between every single combat string of your animation. The usual way that I would do this is have some animation override that would plug into your character, and then with each new weapon you have, every animation that could be played for an attack would be overridden based on the logic of your current weapon. But this is very complicated. Just with the basic light attack and basic heavy attack with our current attack animation for this one weapon, we have 4 light swings, 2 heavy swings, and those are just for grounded attacks. So we would have potentially 4 more in air light swings, and then 2 more in air heavy swings, a launcher attack for different logical states, so that's another attack animation, a slam attack for different attack states, a on the ledge attack, a sliding attack, a from laying on the ground like you're being lazy, a get-up attack, that's what those are called. The point is that every weapon could have a lot of potential attack animations, and if I'm doing an override for each of these and also setting them up in the animator, it's getting excessively complicated. So if only, I said, stroking my chin, if only I had a scripting basis that would just organically create and blend into different specific attack animations based on scripting, something that I know about. So I made a script to dynamically make attack animations happen. How does this work, you may ask? Well, I'll tell ya. The way it works in our combat scripting is we have 3 different animations, this being readying, swinging, and recoil. This can be adapted into more when I have different animation attack types like launchers or slams, which will work differently, but for now it's those 3 types. The animations that these animations have does not matter in the slightest, only that they are different. So all I do is I put in our initial first swing for any attack, and our swing recoil, and our swing swing, and our swing setup into these respective animation states. Then whenever we launch an attack, I will put into a script what our current attack is, whether it's the beginning of the beginning of an attack being a readying, a swing, or a recoil, and the attack animation we want to play, this being our one-handed sword swing, for example, our first swing. What we do with this script is we tell our animation to replace our designated animation with the one we want. This would be, for example, we want to play our attack readying animation of our current weapon, so we will replace the dud animation for this in our animation override. We will then blend into this animation, so we don't need any animator blending logic for that. We will just blend into it manually with the name of the animation, and then we will find out how long this animation is based on our animation's speed. This is based on our weapon speed. Essentially, each weapon could be using the same animations but playing them differently. So for example, a dagger could use the same swing as a short sword, but a dagger would playing it very quickly. So these are just different overrides that each weapon could have, where whichever animation it has can be played at different speed. So we multiply this by our animation's length, then we find a timer of how long this animation is going to take to play. We blend into this animation, so the animation is going to play, and then we take a timer down based on what this animation is and its length. Once this timer has gone to 0, we transition into the next animation that needs to be played. So if this animation was a readying animation, we will transition into a swinging animation. We will find the animation we're currently using, or we already have a reference to it. We have a reference to the animation we're currently using and what our animation was, as in if it was a readying or a swinging animation. We will then replace our current animation, the one that is currently playing, with our current animation. That makes no sense, but there's a weird glitch with the animator, so don't worry about it, I just have to do that. and then we replace our next animation with the animation we want to play next, this being the swinging animation. We find a timer of how long this animation is going to play, and we run the same logic. This timer ticks down. Once this timer reaches 0, our current animation is replaced by our swinging animation, and our next animation is replaced by our recoil animation. We have another timer. This ticks down. Once this reaches 0, our recoil animation is our current animation, and then if we haven't pressed any more inputs, we transition out of this animation, or if we have played an input, our next animation will be our next swing readying attack, so this being our swing follow-up attack. This loops on for how many attacks we are doing, and this organically changes the attack animations we are playing in our scripting based on what our weapon attacks are. Essentially, this is a way to have our attack animations be needlessly complicated animation-wise and have a lot of different unique animations and a lot of adaptability in timing, while not actually having much changes in the Unity animator setup. I really hope some of that made sense. The next thing we have to do is check what attack the player is trying to attempt to make. This may sound easy, as in if you press light, you make a light attack, if you press heavy, you make a heavy attack, but it gets exponentially more complicated based on my scripting code and also the way I'm designing combat. To give a brief overview, because I only have the light and heavy attacks implemented, the way combat is designed is that you have a full set of array of attacks based on what state you are in, as in if you're on the ground, if you're in the air, if you're on a ledge, if you're sliding, etc, etc. But you also have a set of attacks based organically, depending on the positioning of your enemy based on the positioning of your player. So one of these, for example, if the enemy is very far away, we may initiate an attack where the player charges at the enemy very quickly, closing the distance. This would logically be, if we are using an attack that wouldn't hit the enemy and we're very far away, the logic would be that we were trying to get towards them, so we would launch ourselves towards them. That one's pretty obvious. I might add that, I might not. I'm still not 100% on what attack strings I want to add. Another setup of these animation systems could be that if the enemy is in the air or very high above you, you would initiate attack that launches you upwards to their level before initiating an in-air combo. Or if the enemy is on the ground very far below you and you are in the air, you would initiate an attack that slams you down. Essentially, the player finds a suitable attack based on their current state, the enemy's current state, the enemy to player positioning, if there even is an enemy, and our current attack inputs. But for now, all we have is the light and heavy attack inputs. So what we do is we test what the player's attack input is, if they are making an input, if they are not making an input. If they're not making an input, then they're not attacking, so we don't give them an attack. If they are pressing an input, we check if the attack is the current attack the player is using. For example, if the player is already attacking, it would be if they are using a light or heavy attack. If we are pressing the input that corresponds to these, we will say that the next attack the player should do is the next follow-up attack from this. So if they use the first sword swinging animation for a light attack, the next attack should be the second sword swinging animation. Furthermore, if we have reached the end of these attack animations, so let's say a light attack combo has 4 attacks, say swing 4 times, so these will be 4 different attacks. If they have reached the 4th one, we check if the player can loop around to the first one. This is dependent on certain attack combo weaponry. It is just dependent on if this attack string combo can loop or not. Most would be able to, but some weaponry might not be able to, so I have added this system in just to check for this. If the player can loop back these animations or these attack strings, they will return back the first attack in their attacker combo because they have reached the end of their combo. If they can't loop, then we return back that they can't do this attack. If the attack that they have used is not their current attack, so if they're using a light attack combo and they want to go into a heavy attack combo, we will check if that attack can be transitioned into, as in, can this attack be transitioned into if we are using a different attack? Most attacks, again, should be able to transition to, so you'd be able to initiate a light combo and then go into a heavy combo, or initiate a heavy combo and go into a light combo, but some weaponry might not have this ability. This is just a design principle that I have added for the future, which may not ever come up. If we can transition into different attacks, we will return the first attack of the attack we are trying to transition into. This is just a function to determine what attack we are wanting to use for our player based on our inputs. There is also a system to check for charging attacks, but I haven't implemented that yet. Essentially, if we are holding an input for a certain amount of time, we will instead release back that the player should go into a charge attack, which is essentially they've just held down the attack input, and this will trigger into a different attack type. In these instances, we just return the charge attack, but all this does is return back our attack that we're wanting to use, and this is then fed to our attack scripting in our movement states to determine our actions and suitable attacks and suitable animations. How does that work? I will explain it right now! Next, we have the logic for how the attack script actually works. This is essentially how the script reads what attack inputs we are trying to do and logically makes our attack for us. What we do is that this script doesn't run during regular gameplay, meaning that if we're not attacking, this script isn't doing anything, so it's just like a little dead script. If we press the attack input and we have an attack readied, as in we can attack, then we'll tick this script once. And this means we run the script once and we check if we are attacking. If the script then says that we are attacking, we switch to our attack states. If we are running the script and we're not attacking, this is in the script's idle state, so all we do is we take this current attack that has been fed into it, we check if it is a valid attack, which it always is. But just in case it isn't, there's a cancel out function for that, and if it is, we will send into our then attack state based on what the current attack has been fed to it. As in, if it's a normal attack, we will then change into a normal attack state. If it's a slam attack, we change to a slam attack state, just for each individual attack's typing of movements. After this, while we're in our attack state, we will tick this script continuously, meaning this script is now always functioning. Once we have started attacking, we set up our timers and all of our animations, as mentioned earlier, and we tick through our logical scripting for how each attack function would work. So for the regular attacks, we are in our attack state, we are in our current state of the setting up our attack, meaning that we are readying our attack. In terms of our attack scripting, all we do in this function of the readying state is we tick down our timer. Once our timer has reached 0, we will transition into our next attack state. This changes our attack animation that we need to do into our swing attack animation. It resets any timers for how long the swing should take, and it moves into our swing attack substate of our attack system, which is a control of the player's substate system. So this is the substate system. The readying state is the most basic state of the attack system, so it doesn't do much, but the swinging attack state is the most complicated attack state system because it has to handle attack frame data. What is attack frame data, you may ask? This is the logical controlling for when the attack is actually dealing damage to the player. The swing attack animation might go from having your sword straight behind you to your sword swung completely around behind you on the other side, but you're only going to be dealing damage to enemies at certain frames of these attack animations. So, we need to have a logic in place for when these attacks are actually going to damage enemies. Ordinarily, if you were logically inclined, this would be using a system of attack, not attack, animation, events. I completely forgot what those were called. The reason I forgot what animation events were called is because I hate them. I only use animation events for visual effects now. I used to use them for attack effects. This would be there would be a pulse or an animation event on each attack animation that would say when the attack animation has its hitboxes enabled and when it has its hitboxes disabled, or where they should be, or things of that nature, but I don't like them. I have used them in the past and I've always found them a bit too bothersome to set up, so I made a complicated timer system to accommodate for not using them. Personally, I think since I was already using a timer-based system for a lot of these animations, having animation events in place for the actual attacks just didn't really make much sense to me to go out of my way to do that when I already had a system in place that could accommodate for it. And personally speaking, it's just a bit easier for me to do the complicated mathematical system setup than having an animation event in place. This is just better for me. I do fully acknowledge that maybe animation events are probably the better way of handling hitboxes for attack animations, but also I just like this system. The way it works is each attack animation has a set of values for when a hitbox would be enabled and when a hitbox would be disabled, and this is taken as a percentage value of how long the animation plays, so it's modified by our attack animation times. And then, if the attack animation timer is above when a attack hitbox should be enabled and below when an attack hitbox should be disabled, we will check for attack collision with this attack weapon. That is its own complicated system, so I will talk about that later in the video, but just keep in mind that that is happening in the attack sub-state system when we are swinging our weapon. After this has happened and our timer has ticked down to 0 in our attack state, nothing else can happen in our attack state, so we transition to our recoil state. Our recoil state happens the exact same way as our regular attack states, but with a couple of overrides for what can happen in this state. The timer will still tick down to tick down to 0 for how long our recoil should happen for. If the timer hits to 0, we will transition out of our recoil animation and we will transition back into being in a normal attack state. Unless there is one override for attack weapons which will automatically transition into the next attack animation. This is for very quick attacks, so if you were using a dagger perhaps, and the attack animation where you swipe 3 times very quickly, this would be 4 individual attacks, you would have no control over these, and they would transition into the second and third attacks automatically. If this is the case, when the timer ticks to 0, we will transition into our next attack automatically. But this is very uncommon and not really needed to point out, so I'm just pointing it out for funsies. However, if we make an attack input, as in we are trying to make another attack, in the recoil state we will transition into this new attack input. If it is another of the same attack, we will transition into the same attack. If it's a different attack, we will transition into a different attack, resetting our attack combo string. And in this instance, the scripting just resets in on itself. We repeat from the beginning, over and over in a loop. If you want to attack forever, you really can. You can hit a wall for eternity. And that's everything about how attack scripting works in the basics of its attack scripting subsystems. Now let's talk about the primary subsystems of attack scripting, not those subsystems, these subsystems. These are just the type of attack we are playing. This is relative to the current attack string weapon type. These are all normal at the moment, so this is going to be a very short section. But this is essentially the type of attack we are using. What I just described was a normal attack function, but there's different attack types, like ones that could launch an enemy. No, that would be a normal attack with modifiers and knockback, never mind. An attack that would dive towards an enemy, an attack that would launch the player upwards towards an enemy, an attack that would maneuver the player in a specific way, an attack that would slam down on the ground. These are essentially just primary subsystems of the attack state. So when our attack state is set up, it would set up what our attack would be, and then instead of using a normal readying, swing, recoil setup for our attack, movements, we would instead derive a different movement information in the future for these specific attack movement systems. But none of these are implemented, and I'm going to implement them later on and add more detailed combat. But I'm just pointing out that the system is adapted in a way that would make that easy. Next, we have the animation hit detection, or the attack hit detection, hitbox, hurtbox, hit detection, whatever. As explained in the attack state or the swinging state, when the player is using an attack and they're in between the attack animations and they are going to deal damage, we run a system to check for damage. This is a complicated system. Essentially, all we do is we find a sphere cast for how ranged the current weapon is. We find a direction that we are aiming in, as in this is the position that the sword would be, or the weapon would be swinging to hit an enemy. Usually this is straightforward, but some weapons have overrides where maybe an attack starts to the right and then moves forward and then hurts to the left, so it could have hitboxes in different directions, but that's not important. Essentially, this is just a position and range for each weapon to damage things. What we do is we make a sphere cast in this area. We check for any collision hitboxes. I made a different video on a different game for collision hitboxes, but I overuse the same hitbox scripting in this one just for the hitboxes. So if you're curious, go watch that one. We compile an array of all of these potential hitboxes that we can hit. We will then sort this array by how many hitboxes are closest to us. So the closest to our player or where we were attacking are going to be the ones we're checking first. More on this later. And by later, I mean right now. We then check every single hitbox to make sure it is not part of the same object. Essentially, if you don't know what hitboxes are, they're the parts of the I guess they're hurt boxes. I always use it interchangeably. They're the part of the player that you can deal damage to, so essentially the collision box for the legs or the torso or the head. These are the points where the enemy is going to be dealt damage. We find the one that's closest to the attack, as in which one we're attacking. So if we hit the leg, it would feedback the leg being closest, or the arm being closest, or the head being closest. This is, for example, if certain enemies take more damage on the head, or certain body parts are armored, for example, we are going to be dealing damage to those specific body parts because they are closest to the player. Most enemies are going to have the same hitbox damage type for most of their body parts because there's no real aiming in this. It's just sort of hacking and slashing at enemies. But for example, if an enemy was gigantic and you were hitting them on the head, it's going to be dealing more damage because you had to maneuver your way onto a weak point, kind of like Monster Hunter, where the monsters have weak points and you finagle your way to them, kind of like that, where you can just deal more damage at certain hitboxes. But for this scripting, we're just finding the one that's closest to our damage output system. We then check if we can actually target this hitbox. Essentially, since you're using a sphere cast and we're only detecting hitboxes, there could be a wall in the way and we could be hitting an enemy through a wall. So what we do next is we have a raycast from our player position to this hitbox, or our player's combat position to this hitbox. Don't worry about that, it doesn't make sense. Our player's combat position to the hitbox, and then if we do not have an unobstructed ray to this hitbox, there isn't anything in the way of this hitbox, and we can damage this enemy. So we deal damage to this point that we have found. Then all we have to do is remove every hitbox from our list of arrays of potential hitboxes that belongs to the same origin object. So we can't be hitting the enemy for double damage because we hit two of their hitboxes in one swipe. We find the most logically suitable hitbox to deal damage to with our closeness to these hitboxes. We find the hitbox that we can actually hit the most. So if we can't hit this hitbox, we will find every other hitbox that we detected by this enemy. And then if we can deal damage to any hitbox based on the priority of each hitbox, then we will remove all other hitboxes belonging to this enemy. This is just to remove any overlapping damage values. finally, we continue to run the scripting for every other hitbox enemy that we could have found. So if our attack has hit 2 enemies in one swipe, we will deal damage to both enemies because they have different hitbox origins, this being that they are different enemies. Finally, we'll add all of these enemy origins to a list, being every enemy that we have damaged with this current attack swipe. This meaning, because our attack swipe happens for more than one frame, we could detect these enemies once again as our attack goes on. So we've swung through these enemies and then another frame ticks, we detect any more collision and we'll detect the same enemies. If we detect the same enemies again, we will ignore these in any future damage inputs from this current attack, but we will reset this value once we have finished this attack. So essentially we can't just deal damage to an enemy every single frame that they are hit by a attack, only the first time they are hit by this attack, but this resets once we have done this attack. And that's everything about hitboxes, hurtboxes, and alertboxes. I then worked on the logic for damage values. I already included a video of how I made these with the stat system in an earlier devlog, but in this video, devlog, I made it so that the player's combat when hitting an enemy derives information from the player's stat values and then collides with the enemy for the enemy's stat values and subtracts values based on that. So the combat is fixed on the stat values I had created earlier. I then worked on how combat works with your player movements. This is in a few specific ways. If we're on the ground and using combat, then we will initiate our combat strings. Our player will be pushed forward with each attack based on the attack's push force. Essentially, when we swing forward, we have a forward momentum added to our character. The player will mostly smooth to a stop when using normal attacks, as in you can't really run around and control your character when using normal attacks. I will probably add attacks in the future where you can run around and control your character, but that would be a different attack sub-state, so for now it's just this one. If the player falls off a ledge while attacking, they will enter into the air attack state, which is a different attack state where the player moves while attacking in air. But when on the ground and the player is attacking, they will slowly smooth to a stop, and then force is added as they swing, and they will slowly move to a stop again. When attacking in the air, the player will defy gravity while they attack for normal air attacks. This is just they are floating in the air and initiating an attack combo. Most air attack combos don't loop, which means at the end of them you have to stop attacking, and once you've stopped attacking in midair, you'll enter the air recovery state, meaning you cannot further any more additional attacks until you get out of this state. You remove the air recovery state by either wall running and then jumping off a wall, which is very difficult to do because you can't wall run when air recovering. Never mind, ignore I just said that. You can get out of the state by landing on the ground and resetting your state and sub-state functions. Also, in some instances, if the player was able to take a certain level of damage in the in-air, they will be knocked out of their sub-state system by entering into a different air recovery state. This isn't really programmed enough yet, so I won't talk about it, but essentially if you've attacked in air and you've finished your combo, you can no longer attack anymore in mid-air. These systems also have a different value of rotation. When you initialize an attack, you will snap rotate to the closest enemy towards you. This is for easy aiming. Essentially, we have a logic function with the lock-on system for finding the most logical enemy towards the player's movement direction. I made a whole video about it, don't worry about it. The player will snap to look at the enemy they are meaning to attack on, or if the player is locked on, they will just snap to rotate towards that enemy. This is just to make sure your attacks really focus in on what you're aiming at. You can also slightly change the rotation of your character when attacking. If you are locked on, you will automatically rotate slightly if the enemy is moving, but this is very slow. If you are not locked on, you can change it slightly with your input directions, but this is lesser than if you are locked on. Essentially, if you've left an attack, you are committed to your rotation of your attack and can only influence it very slightly. Then finally, I worked on the animation effect for when you swing a sword or a weapon. or anything. You've probably noticed this throughout the entire video. When you swing the weapon, it has a nice little trail behind it. This is to imitate the impression of a smear frame. If you don't know what a smear frame is, it's an animation technique, and you bet your bippy I'm going to talk about it. Smear frames are common in 2D animation. They are essentially, you've probably seen them, they're essentially the animation frame for a very exaggerated or extreme motion, where it can look like the character is being blended towards different motions, like a few different running animations blended together, with a lot of drawn in blur. It is generally each animator's personal taste for how many smear frames they want to include in something. Some don't like using any smear frames, some only use a couple. Or if you're me, you use smear frames at every single opportunity you possibly could, because I like drawing smear frames. But this is my attempt to make them in 3D. Essentially, it is a trail function that follows the weaponry, and I'll get onto that in a moment, that gives the impression of the weapon blurring when moving very quickly. It's the same color as the weapon, so it gives the impression that the weapon itself is being cartoonishly blurred as it moves very quickly. As we're watching this frame by frame, you definitely get the impression it is a particle effect or a blur effect or a line renderer in engine and is not an actual smear frame or an actual blur, but I think when playing quickly in gameplay, you can ignore this impression and it might look a little bit better. The second reasoning for using this instead of an actual particle system for, or actual line render system for your weaponry like other games may have, is that I personally think that games use fewer particle effects in their weaponry movements, just like the general blur or wind effects as you swing a weapon, the lesser the better. So this is sort of a cartoonish but still simplistic version of what a weapon effect could be. The way this works is incredibly simple. We have the trail render of a particle system enabled on our weaponry for the length of the weapon. We have this disabled and we have the trail set to world space. Then we just enable it whenever the player is swinging their weapon and disable it once the player has entered the recoil state. And then as the player moves, this moves with the weapon, it draws along a line. In the world space, these particles die very quickly and the trails die very quickly, and therefore it resets and makes these blurry lines as the player swings. I think this is a really cool effect for sword visuals. What do you think? Leave a comment below. And that is about everything I have done this week. I also did some minor editing to weapon equipment systems, and also enemy hitboxes, and also stat values, and a few other minor things, but this video is already, let's check how long it is. Oh, too long. And also these features are a little bit difficult to talk about in the sense that they are just abstract number values, so that's everything I did this week. In the next week's devlog, I'm either going to work on more combat strings, more combat types, or a dodge roll mechanic. For every action game must have a dodge roll. If you want to see that, you should like and subscribe and ring that notification bell. And let me know in the comments if you found this video through an obscure YouTube search trying to find some Unity tutorial or database on how to code an attack string system in a very highly specific way. Then, given the sparse results, watched my video through to its entirety in the hopes that I would explain how this worked in more concise, detailed manners, and are now more confused than you were at the start of how to even code such a system.